Hello, everyone, and welcome back after a bit of a break to this new episode of the Rose and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chawla, and as always, I'm joined by CEO and Head of Research, Mr. Brunello Rosa. This week, we're coming off the heels of another G7 summit. And it's a G7 summit that we've seen iterations of before, but something's a little bit different this time because the response to it where we're seeing a G7 possibly for developing countries, converging, particularly the polarized geopolitical context that we have. So Brunello, could you give us a little bit of insight into what this possible emerging markets G7 could look like? But also, most importantly, why now? Why is now the right time for a country like Russia and China to actually materialize on this need to bring developing countries back into the fold?
Yeah, so first of all, we have seen recently the traditional G7 gathering in Germany and coming up with important conclusions on the most relevant current affairs, and of course also some of the more long-term risks out there, including climate change and the fight to pandemics and so on and so forth. While all this is happening, the emerging markets feel a bit left aside in all this discussion. Some of them were invited, in fact, by the traditional G7, Argentina, India, Indonesia, Senegal, and South Africa, among others, were invited in Germany. But the forum where EM countries were meeting, the G20 forum, has now lost lots of its grip, because this war that has emerged, we discussed many times, after the war in Ukraine, is polarized, like the UN Security Council, divided between US, France, UK on the one side, and China, Russia on the other side. The G20 is polarized. They are the allies of the US, the allies of China, and so not much dialogue between the two sides. Global governance is collapsing. As a further development, somehow unfortunate if you want, but perhaps inevitable, it's like when the big G7 countries, the developed countries, meet, then the others around BRICS feel that, well, you know what, we have the largest populations in the world, some of the fastest growing economies are among us. Clearly, G7 countries will remain an important reference point, but there's an entire new world that is developing, and this requires some form of representation. And here we are. We want to provide this kind of representation.
Mm. So there's quite that sort of trend that's been following along for years, but which is finally it's the moment now that the sort of geopolitical context gives it
Yeah.
a catalyzing moment to let it act. And so I find it quite sort of quite peculiar that in response to this they're creating a sort of EMG7 and expanded BRICS essentially. But I find it peculiar that the two countries they're trying to reach consensus on in terms of expanding are Saudi Arabia and Argentina. Why these two countries, Manolo?
Well, the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, represent large segments of the EM population and economies. But there are lots of other large countries, influential countries, resource-rich countries that can be attached, and somehow, not surprisingly, from the five of the BRICS, you add two and you reach the magic number of 7. And clearly, the motivation is, first of all, these are the two countries that have actually expressed an interest in joining the BRICS gathering and conglomerate, so to speak. And so it's somehow demand driven, but this is also perfect new candidates for BRICS, because especially Saudi Arabia can bring lots of natural resources, in particular oil. This is not a mystery. Equally, Argentina can bring lots of natural resources in spite of its difficult financial past, if you want, which might having make it look more liability than an asset. But again, as I said before, the G7 countries also invited Argentina. More interesting, perhaps, is what India is doing. We discussed this in the past. India is one of the largest countries that can still decide which side wants to be between US and China. Traditionally closer to Russia during the Cold War I, has now moved more towards the US. In particular, it belongs to the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. Somebody call it the NATO of the Pacific. But it has huge tensions with China, and therefore being close to Russia while Russia and China are together might provide some difficulties to India, who still needs to decide. Well, in this forum, the BRICS, well, guess what? India is also with China and Russia. So to some extent is yet another forum in which India is besides Russia and China. So I wouldn't take it for granted that India will eventually side with the US. And if you think about China and India, the two largest populations in the world, India, one of the fastest growing economies in the world, Russia, plenty of natural resources, and of course also Brazil is a huge, almost continental economy. So we are talking about large chunks of the world, either population or economy, that have practically decided to go on their own. They are not waiting for developed economies to come, so to speak, to the rescue, or to ask them whether they want to participate in some tables.
Right. It sort of reminds me of there's a little video clip online that went viral of the Indian foreign minister at one of these sort of think tank events, and when asked whether he feels worried that the West won't come to its rescue in a future conflict with China because it hasn't supported the West in the conflict in Ukraine, he said something along the lines of the sort of Europe needs to get out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems. And so I think that really symbolizes that very distinct kind of non-aligned tradition that they want to continue.
Yes.
And so I also kind of want to go back on, one key way that I think sort of key development out of the G7 summit that we finally saw coming after lots of previous iterations is their, investment in infrastructure, which, possibly because of the war and because of the pandemic and on all sorts of other things might have been overshadowed in the news. But they seem to have pledged to raise about $600 billion in what they term to be essentially a Western competitor to the Chinese BRI scheme.
Yeah.
What really is the strategic purpose and sort of objective of this, would you say?
Well, China has started this BRI, as you said, Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, and its strategic objective was, first of all, to be able to offload in foreign countries the excess capacity created domestically, so not to create huge imbalances domestically. The second, of course, was starting projecting its geopolitical influence outside its borders. And it does it on the maritime road and in the terrestrial belt. And the way it gets accepted, so to speak, by the countries is going through is by building infrastructure for them, even financing those infrastructure for them, and then creating this very strong link between China and these countries. Now, for way too long, the West has suffered underinvestment in infrastructure, even domestically. Among the largest economies, the US, Germany, big laggard in investment in infrastructure. They realized that domestically that couldn't be the case anymore. President Biden launched several investment programs. Even Trump before wanted to have a huge investment surge, even if it didn't really materialize. But then Biden would build America better program effectively has started the program. Then they realized that if that's the case for them, it's even bigger issue for developing economies. Hence, they realized that they needed something to rival the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. Honestly, the 600 billions, good starting point. We are still quite far from the several trillions of the BRI initiative, and you have the Asian investment bank, and then you have the other development banks that are involved in the project. It will take some time for the traditional G7 to catch up with what China has already put on the ground.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it takes a while to sort of build not only it's not just about throwing money into it, it's about building the sort of actual infrastructure around it, the financial sort of plumbing of it.
The relationship with the governments and the consensus among population. So it's a long-term project. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes years.
Yeah, no, certainly. And I know while the G7 was happening, sort of very soon, quickly followed by the NATO summit, which is in Madrid, I believe. All of that, being covered by sort of the international news media, I feel like there's an important summit that happened in Russia that, some of our listeners might have missed. It was the International Economic Forum of St. Petersburg, sort of 25th anniversary. Could you tell me a bit more about this forum and sort of what they, achieved in this particular edition of it?
Yeah, the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum is one of the most important ones. It's always been very important. And when Russia was admitted in the G8 in the 90s, clearly flourished and so on. This year, people might have thought that that forum would have been, so to speak, less attended because Russia was isolated because of the war, and there were sanctions and so on and so forth. But in reality, there were plenty of participants, more than 13,000 from lots of countries. They count at least 140 diplomatic delegations from 40 plus countries, CEOs from several companies. We are talking about in the thousand count. So it's hard to describe that as a failure and as a sign that Russia is really isolated. True, they might be coming mostly from countries in East Asia, and perhaps from the Eurasian subcontinent, if you want. However, and clearly the Western companies might have deserted this time around, but clearly that was not a total failure as one might have hoped, which means the following, that Russia can bring to the table is St. Petersburg Economic Forum. China can bring the Belt and Road Initiative, including, of course, plus its economic growth and its population. India can bring its economic growth and huge population, and it's, as I said, a set of relationships, even if they need to be somehow clarified. So, in Saudi Arabia, clearly huge oil reserves. So what we are talking about here is the EMG7, the way I labeled, might not be much weaker than the traditional G7 in terms of what they can actually achieve and represent. And therefore, it needs to be looked with some interest. And I would say, just to conclude, it's kind of the idea that now in a polarized world, we start having a bloc which has NATO, its own G7, and other institutions of that sort. Consider the European Union, on But on the other side, you start having, and of course the dollar. On the other side, you start having a new grouping around the BRICs, plus other key emerging markets such as Saudi Arabia, which has lots of economic power, fast growth, large populations, important economic fora, important geopolitical initiatives such as the BRI, the beginning of some geopolitical geostrategic alliances. So little by little, this second grouping might be taken over, so to speak, the governance of that side of the world. And unfortunately, if you want, the problem is that we start having two competing blocks, one on the west, one on the east, if you want, just to simplify things,
Yeah.
which they might clash at some point or may find it harder to speak to one another in coming years. So somehow Cold War II has found a new dimension that is worth following, in our opinion.
All right. And I think it's worth noting as well that, these as our division isn't primarily along, say, one axis. It's happening along, tons of axes. It's on, there's a political dimension to it. There's an economic, a trade, a military, an infrastructure, and energy, all sorts of sort of reasons that finally these, countries are coalescing along these sort of two diametrical poles that'll, likely define the world order for many sort of years to come. So definitely a discussion we'll keep thinking about for a while in the long term, not just in the short term. So as always, thank you so much for your time and insight, Brunello.
Thank you very much. Until next time.